The Lost Tribes of Israel, Volume 1, The Pre-Exodus Flights. Before the Exodus occurred, the children of Israel had been the masters of Egypt. The first Hebrew to rule was Joseph, the beloved son of Jacob. The biblical book of Genesis describes the great story of Joseph's rise to power. In chapter 37, we are told he was sold by his brothers to become a slave in Egypt. But a few chapters later, Genesis describes him as the essential ruler of the country. We read, "And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, Bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt." Genesis chapter 41, verses 41 through 43. Pharaoh gave Joseph a woman to marry. She was no ordinary lady, but the daughter of a priest from the city of On. The woman's father was probably the high priest of that religious center. The marriage undoubtedly solidified Joseph's powerful position, for in the eyes of the people it would seem that their priesthood, working on behalf of the gods, had approved of his elevation. In time, Joseph's wife gave birth to 2 sons. He named the firstborn Manasseh and the second son Ephraim. Under the prevailing law of primogeniture, Manasseh would inherit everything. However, this could be altered by a declaration from the father. Joseph's reconciliation with his brothers begins in Genesis chapter 42. Their father Jacob, whose name had been changed to Israel, sent his sons from Canaan to Egypt in order to buy food during a famine. All the food they needed could be purchased in Egypt, but only if they bought it from Joseph. The sons of Jacob, the tribes of Israel, were born to him from 4 different women in this order. First, Reuben; second, Simeon; third, Levi; fourth, Judah; fifth, Dan; sixth, Naphtali; seventh, Gad; eighth, Asher; ninth, Issachar; 10th, Zebulun; 11th, Joseph; and 12th was Benjamin. The brothers had no idea Joseph was still alive, or that he had become ruler over all the land. When they arrived in Egypt, he concealed his true identity. Then, according to Genesis chapter 44, Joseph devised a plot to have stolen property planted among his brothers, especially Benjamin. He planned to enslave Benjamin for the crime of thievery, while allowing the others to leave in peace. But in the drama of the moment, Judah stepped forward, made an impassioned speech, and offered to become the slave if Benjamin could go free. Joseph broke into tears and let them know that he was the one they sold. After their reconciliation, Joseph granted the land of Goshen to his brethren. Goshen was the most fertile region by the Nile Delta. Jacob, his flocks and herds, and all of Israel settled in this lush section of Egypt. Jacob lived there for 17 years before the time came to pass along his inheritance. Genesis chapters 48 and 49 describe Jacob's deathbed blessings of his sons. It is important to note that the first thing Jacob did was to adopt Joseph's sons. We read, "And now thy 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which were born unto thee in the land of Egypt before I came unto thee into Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine." Genesis chapter 48, verse 5. With the addition of Joseph's sons, the tribes of Israel were now 13 in number. Reuben was Jacob's firstborn. He would have received all of the inheritance had he not committed incest with one of his father's wives. Genesis chapter 49, verse 4. This gross error opened the door for others to ascend to the birthright, and Jacob chose Ephraim and Manasseh. The inheritance consists of prophetic blessings of future wealth and power from God. These blessings have passed from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and all the way down to our present day. Even though Manasseh was the elder, Jacob switched the ranking and elevated Ephraim. We read, "He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations." Genesis chapter 48, verse 19. Historical evidence indicates that the tribe of Ephraim has become the multitude of nations in the United Kingdom with its British Commonwealth. Many believe that the great tribe of Manasseh is none other than the world's superpower, the USA. Jacob split the birthright blessings between Ephraim and Manasseh. He then divided his inheritance package further by granting Judah the scepter and lawmaking responsibilities. Judah had previously offered to become Joseph's slave in exchange for Benjamin, but now the tribe of Judah would produce the kings. Jacob declares, Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he couched as a lion, and as an old lion. Who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come. Genesis chapter 49, verses 8 through 10. The lion became the national emblem of the tribe of Judah, and the symbol would have appeared on the flags of its enemies. Numbers chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. When Joseph died, a son of Judah was the next Hebrew to rule in Egypt. Judah's firstborn should have reigned, but according to Genesis chapter 38, the Lord slew him. This first son was killed before he and his wife Tamar could produce an heir. Under their societal customs, the second son of Judah was obligated to impregnate Tamar and raise up seed to thy brother. In essence, the child born would be regarded as an offspring of the dead brother, and the lawful heir to the throne. But Judah's second son refused to impregnate Tamar. No doubt he hoped to gain the kingship of Israel for himself. So the Lord slew him too. Judah promised Tamar that she could have his last son. However, the promise was never kept. Firm in her determination to have a child, Tamar disguised herself as a whore in order to sleep with Judah. He was unaware of her true identity, and later he threatened to kill her upon learning that she was pregnant from playing the role of a whore. But Tamar cleverly presented evidence that Judah was the father-to-be, and he acknowledged she was telling the truth. According to Genesis chapter 38, verse 26, Judah also admitted that he should have given his last son to her, and that she was more righteous than I. Tamar's pregnancy produced the next king of the Israelites during their reign in Egypt. We read, And it came to pass in the time of her travail, that, behold, twins were in her womb. And it came to pass, when she travailed, that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, This came out first. And it came to pass, as he drew back his hand, that, behold, his brother came out. And she said, How hast thou broken forth? This breach be upon thee. Therefore his name was called Pharez. And afterward came out his brother, that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was called Zerah. Genesis chapter 38, verses 27 through 30. Which of Judah's twins was born first? At stake was the throne, for the firstborn would rule. Did Zerah of the scarlet hand legally come before Pharez? The midwife used the scarlet thread to keep track of the rightful heir, and indeed the name Zerah means dawn, symbolic of the beginning, the start of day, and the first. History shows that after the Exodus, the Pharez branch of Judah produced such notables as King David, Solomon, and Jesus. But while the Israelites were still in Egypt, the Zerahites reigned. From the Egyptian point of view, the Hebrews were evil foreigners and usurpers of Pharaoh's throne. The ancient Egyptian historian and priest Manetho, 3rd century BC, refers to these foreign rulers as Hyksos. Manetho says that Hik means king and Sos means shepherds in the Egyptian language. Therefore, the rulers from the Zerah branch of Judah were known as the shepherd kings. The Egyptians hated the Hyksos. This brings to mind Joseph's warning to his brethren that they should avoid telling Pharaoh about their occupation, for every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians. Genesis chapter 46, verse 34. Some names of the Zerahite royalty have been preserved in artifacts, Semitic names like Jacob and Hur. Their great leaders, Calcol and Darda, appear in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 31, and 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 6. The reference in 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 31 is an attempt, centuries later, to explain that Solomon's wisdom even excelled the wisdom of the last line of Hebrew kings, the shepherd kings in Egypt. The Hyksos period ran from about 1700 to 1550 BC, at which point their garrisons were destroyed by a new pharaoh from the south. The collapse of the Zerahite rule in Egypt is recorded in a simple biblical statement. We read, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph." Exodus chapter 1 verse 8. The Bible goes on to describe the Israelite enslavement, and then it tells the story of Moses, the Hebrew deliverer. Moses would lead the conquered Israelites toward the promised land of Canaan in the Exodus, which some scholars date to 1453 BC. Take note, though, that the Exodus led by Moses was not the first Hebrew departure. Ancient Greeks and Egyptians were well acquainted with more than one Exodus. For example, the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, circa 18 through 20 BC, tells of several flights to freedom in his series of books called the Library of History. In one reference to the Israelites, Diodorus says that the aliens were driven from the country of Egypt, that the most outstanding and active among them banded together, and that they were cast ashore in Greece and certain other regions. Their leaders were notable men, chief among them being Danaus and Cadmus, but that the greater number were driven into what is now called Judea, and that colony was headed by a man called Moses. Diodorus is clearly describing common-sense events that must have taken place during the battles in which the Zerahites were overthrown prior to the Exodus. Hebrew tribal chieftains, the rich and powerful citizens, and the royal Zerah branch of Judah would surely have had their escape routes planned as their diminishing armies and garrisons were destroyed. Indeed, all who could afford the price would gladly pay for passage aboard the ships and fleets sailing for Greece and certain other regions. The wealthy Hebrews reached safe landfalls, but the poor Israelites were left behind to be enslaved, and their descendants waited for the deliverer Moses. Even in our own time we have witnessed a similar event. When Iraq overran Kuwait in the Persian Gulf War, AD 1990 through 1991, the Kuwaiti royal family and others fled the country for safe havens around the world. In another segment of his books, Diodorus records certain claims made by the Egyptians. They claim that great numbers of colonies were spread from Egypt over all the inhabited world, that the exiles led by Danaus settled what is practically the oldest city of Greece, Argos, that the nation of the Colchi in Pontus and that of the Jews were established by certain immigrants from their country, and that even the Athenians are colonists from Sais in Egypt. The city of Sais is located in the Nile Delta. The Colchi in Pontus is Colchis on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. The facts presented by Diodorus and the Egyptians indicate more than one exodus of Hebrews. The city-states of Argos and Athens and the nation of Colchis were among those settled by the Israelites. Danaus and Cadmus receive mention in the historical list beside their fellow kinsman Moses. We will examine each group, each band that escaped the turmoil of a losing war. They sailed away from Egypt and away from the pages of the Bible, but the writers of antiquity have preserved knowledge of their destinations and subsequent lives. The trails of these Hebrews are closely followed in Greek literature, laying the foundations for many of the greatest Grecian tales. Argos in the Peloponnesus was the ultimate destination for the fleet led by Danaus. The Greek historian Herodotus, 5th century BC, informs us that the ships made a stopover at Rhodes. In his Histories, Herodotus mentions that a temple of Athene on Rhodes was founded by the daughter of Danaus, who touched at the island during their flight from the sons of Aegyptus. Obviously, the Hebrews had lapsed into paganism. The Book of Sothis, attributed to Manetho, says that when Danaus arrived in Greece, he took possession of Argos. The city already existed. Its ruler, a man named Sthenelus, was driven out by Danaus. In the same book, Manetho also says that the descendants of Danaus were called Danaidae. Ancient Greek literature refers to them as both Argives and Danaians, Danaidae and Danae. The Danaians spread throughout all of Greece, reaching as far north as Macedonia. The word Macedonia retains Dan's name, Macedania. It is interesting to note an incident that took place 1,000 years later during the Olympic Games. According to Herodotus, a Macedonian prince named Alexander I wanted to enter a foot race. His Greek competitors claimed he was ineligible since the games were closed to foreigners. But Alexander was able to prove his Argive lineage, in essence that he was a Danaan, and he went on to win the race. As his name implies, Danaus was a leader in the tribe of Dan. The Hebrew Danites were known as sailors, sailing merchants. While the wealthy ship owners in the tribe made their escape from Egypt, many Danites were left behind. Their descendants departed in the Exodus led by Moses. It was not an accidental choice that during the subsequent Israelite conquest of Canaan, a coastal territory was assigned to the tribe of Dan. Joshua chapter 19, verse 21. Like their ancestors, the mariners of old, the Danites in the Promised Land returned to the sea. We learn this from Judges chapter 5, verse 17, when Deborah rallied the Israelites to fight, and the question was asked, why did Dan remain in ships? Danites often added their name to the places they reached. Examples of this appear in Judges chapter 18, which describes events involving a group of Danites who left their territory to conquer more land. Judges chapter 18, verse 12 says that while passing through Judah's territory, they pitched in Kirjath Jearim, and called that place Mahana Dan unto this day. The term Mahana Dan means the camp of Dan. The raiding party continued northward through Judah's land until they reached the peaceful inhabitants of Laish. They took the city of Laish by force. Then, according to Judges chapter 18, verse 29, they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan their father, who was born unto Israel. In the Hebrew language, which lacks vowels, Dan consists of the letters DN. Therefore, a place with Dan, Den, Din, Don, or Dun in its name, like Macedonia, is a potential site for a Danite colony. In Jacob's blessing of Dan, he says, Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path. Genesis chapter 49, verse 17. According to some scholars, this means the tribe of Dan will follow winding courses, serpentine trails, leaving their DN marks to act as signposts in the nations they reach. Ancient Jewish authorities say that the snake was one of the emblems used on Dan's flag, along with the eagle. The scriptures indicate that the symbols for the 4 leading tribes are Judah's lion, Ephraim's ox or bull, Reuben's face of a man, and Dan's eagle. See Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 10 and Revelation chapter 4 verse 7 when applied to the camp positions the Lord established in Numbers 2. The Danites brought their eagle and snake emblems to Greece. Perhaps the first written reference to Dan's symbols is hinted at in Homer's Iliad, concerning the 12th century BC Trojan War. By this time period, the Greek Danaans had grown powerful, possessing many independent city-states. The Trojan War began when a prince of Troy named Paris ran off with Helen, the queen of Sparta. Menelaus was the king of Sparta. He called upon his kinsmen chieftains of Greece to help him recover his wife. King Agamemnon, who ruled over the Argives from Mycenae, was the brother of Menelaus and the one chosen to lead the Danaans in battle. The sailing tribe of Dan put together the world's largest fleet, and the famous 1,000 ships made landfall at Troy. The Hebrew-Trojan War lasted 10 years. During one of the battles, the fighting men of Troy tried burning the Greek ships on the beachhead. According to Homer, they halted at a moat momentarily and witnessed a terrifying omen in the sky. We read, "Just then, as they desired to cross, a bird flew by them, heading to the left across the army. An eagle, beating upward, in its claws a huge snake, red as blood, alive and jerking, full of fight. It doubled on itself and struck the captor's chest and throat. At this the eagle in its agony let go and veered away, screaming downward. The snake fell in the mass of troops, and Trojans shuddered to see the rippling thing lie in their midst. Iliad, Book 12. The terror caused by this omen is understandable. Still, it takes on greater meaning when we realize that for the entire war the Trojans saw this very image of an eagle clutching a snake. For this was the emblem on the Danaan banners, the battle flags of the tribe of Dan. With the invention of coinage at the close of the 7th century BC, Dan's eagle and snake began to appear on the early issues from some of the Greek city-states. For example, starting in about 510 BC, silver coins from Chalcis depict these symbols. Production ended in 146 BC with the coming of the Romans. Likewise, the coins from Elis show an eagle grasping a snake. The Danaans of Elis controlled the famous festival site of Olympia. Their coinage was actually issued from the site throughout the centuries in connection with each celebration of the Olympic Games. The Danaan city of Sparta was also known as Lacedaemon. King Arius reigned there from 309 to 265 BC, during which he sent a letter of great significance to Onias, the Jewish high priest at Jerusalem. Onias led the priesthood from 320 through 290 BC. The letter initiated an exchange of epistles about 150 years later between the Jews and Spartans. These letters are recorded in 1 Maccabees, chapter 12, verse 5 through 23, and chapter 14, verses 20 through 23, and in the Antiquities of the Jews, written by the Jewish historian Josephus, 1st century AD. We read, Arius, king of the Lacedaemonians, to Onias, sendeth greeting. We have met with a certain writing, whereby we have discovered that both the Jews and the Lacedaemonians are of one stock, and are derived from the kindred of Abraham. It is but just, therefore, that you, who are our brethren, should send to us about any of your concern as you please. We will also do the same thing, and esteem your concerns as our own, and will look upon our concerns as in common with yours. Demoteles, who brings you this letter, will bring your answer back to us. This letter is foursquare, and the seal is an eagle with a dragon in his claws. Josephus, Book 12. The Jews replied that they were well satisfied from their own writings with the Spartan king's claim of kinship through Abraham, and it is interesting to note that King Arius sealed his letter with the tribe of Dan's emblem, the eagle and snake, or dragon. As previously cited, Diodorus Siculus lists Cadmus as one of the important Hebrews driven from Egypt. Cadmus founded the Greek city-state of Thebes, and Herodotus credits his group for bringing the letters of the alphabet from Phoenicia to Greece. While Diodorus places him with the Israelites, according to Herodotus, Cadmus was also considered a Phoenician prince from the city of Tyre. Using this information, we can speculate that Cadmus was a fleet-owning Hebrew, probably from the seafaring tribe of Dan, who conducted business in the Phoenician ports. Danites and the Phoenicians often cooperated on voyages with intermingled crews. Maybe Cadmus married into the Phoenician ruling class, or acquired one of their princesses for his harem. Perhaps he was simply half Hebrew and half Tyrian, like the man in 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 14. Colchis, on the eastern coast of the Black Sea, was the destination for another colony of Israelites. Diodorus mentions them in the same breath with Danaus as previously cited. Furthermore, Diodorus links the Colchi to the Jews and Egyptians when he says these three nations practiced the custom of circumcision. Greek history also preserves an intriguing connection between the Danaans and the Colchi, in the legend of Jason and the Argonauts. This famous story involves a Greek king who put away his wife in favor of another woman. The divorced wife, worried for the safety of her two children, Helle and Phrixus, set them on a flying ram. The ram flew to Colchis, but Helle fell off near Troy. Princess Helle died in the sea at the strait named for her, the Hellespont. Prince Phrixus continued on to Colchis, where he sacrificed the ram. Its golden fleece was placed in a sacred grove. Years later, Jason went to Colchis in search of the golden fleece. Jason was a royal relative of Phrixus from a neighboring Greek kingdom. He and his brave Argonauts, the bold heroes in Danaan tales, were successful in their quest, and Jason brought the Golden Fleece back to Greece. The elements in the Golden Fleece story provide the ingredients for a Hebrew inheritance quarrel. Did the myth makers pick Colchis out of the blue because they needed a destination for the ram's flight? Or instead, were Helle and Phrixus simply sent to Colchis to live with their Israelite relatives? Phrixus was crown prince, but with his mother's divorce, his life was in danger. His father's new wife would kill him to clear the way for her own children to reign. Therefore, Helle and Phrixus escaped by sea, perhaps in a boat with the image of a ram on its sail. Troy could have been a stop along their course, for the Trojans controlled the Hellespont Strait. We will learn that the Trojans were descendants of Abraham too. Helle stayed at Troy, or she fell overboard and was lost, and Jason's voyage was probably an attempt to bring back Phrixus, the crown prince and rightful heir. Athens was founded by the legendary King Cecrops. As previously cited, Diodorus says the Athenians came from Sais in Egypt. Cecrops must therefore have led one of the bands of fleeing Hebrews. The ancients describe him as half man and half snake. This suggests he had a relationship with the tribe of Dan and their snake symbol. Some scholars maintain that Cecrops is none other than Chalcol of the Zerah branch of Judah. Chalcol and Darda were Zerahites that later generations remembered, especially when comparing great rulers to Solomon. See 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 31 and 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 6. In early Athenian history, the people had a connection to the island of Crete. Tradition says the Athenians paid tribute to the Cretan king Minos. Each year they sent him a certain number of their youth to be devoured by his famous Minotaur, housed in the labyrinth. The tribute ceased when Prince Theseus of Athens slew the Minotaur. With this information we can speculate that during Chalcol, or Cecrops' flight from Egypt, his group's first landfall was at Crete. Chalcol and his band of Israelites were allowed to sail on to establish Athens, but they owed the mighty Cretans a debt for their safety and fresh supplies. The debt was paid each year in the tribute of Athenian youth, and the payments were stopped when Theseus proved Athens had finally become a formidable power to Crete. Chalcol, or Cecrops, is said to have founded 12 cities. The city of Chalcis, with its eagle and snake coinage, located north of Athens, would seem to retain his name. Due to the lack of vowels in Hebrew, the Golden Fleece region of Colchis could represent another variation of the name Chalcol. Like their Phoenician counterparts, the seafaring Danites and Zerahites spread colonies throughout the Mediterranean. It is even said that Chalcol planted a royal dynasty of Irish kings in Ulster. Indeed, the ancient Greeks often spoke highly of the Irish. They called them the Hyperboreans, meaning the people who live beyond the north wind. Diodorus says that the Hyperboreans are most friendly disposed towards the Greeks, and especially towards the Athenians. The legends of Ireland also record early contact with the Greeks. Information contained in the Irish Liabar Gabala, or Book of Invasions, indicates that in ancient times the island underwent a series of 5 invasions. Geoffrey Keating, circa AD 1570 through 1646, compiled a history of Ireland using the Liabar Gabala and sources that are now lost. In Keating's History of Ireland from the earliest period to the English invasion, he describes the first invaders as colonists led by Partholonus. They came from Mygdonia, or the middle of Greece, and they all perished in a plague. The second group were kinsmen of the Partholonians, called Nemedians. The Nemedians were harassed by Formorian pirates from Africa. Eventually they threw out the Formorian mariners, but fearing their return, the Nemedians departed Ireland and went back to Greece. The third colonization was carried out by descendants of the Nemedians, known as Firbolgs. Before their arrival, the Firbolgs had stopped off in Spain. They were called the men of the leather bags, perhaps in reference to bagpipes. The fourth conquest of Ireland was accomplished by another branch of the Numidians, the Tuatha De Danann. Keating says that some antiquarians claim the Tuatha De Danann came from Athenian territory, and the fifth invasion was carried out by the Milesians, whose history traces back to Greek Ionians from Miletus. From the Irish point of view, all of the people who colonized their island were Greeks, with Chalcol and the Tuatha De Danann having family ties to Athens. The term Tuatha means a tribe of people. According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, 15th edition, Tuatha De Danann is Gaelic for the people of the goddess Danu. Other experts offer a much simpler meaning and interpret Tuatha De Danann as the tribe of Dan. Greek Danaans from the Hebrew tribe of Dan became the Tuatha De Danann of Ireland. Before their invasions of Ireland, the Israelites established settlements in Spain. The Spanish title Don is derived from Dan, whose name means that he judges. Within Spain is the important Ebro River, signifying the Hebrew River. The term Iberia also represents the word Hebrew. Iberia, Iberians, and the Iberian Peninsula of Spain and Portugal simply mean the Hebrew country, the Hebrews, and the Hebrew Peninsula. It is interesting to note that dictionaries and encyclopedias list two places known as Iberia. One is Spain and Portugal, and the other Iberia is the Israelite region south of the Caucasus on the eastern border of Colchis. When the Hebrew invaders sailed from Spain, they apparently brought their name to the Emerald Isle, for the Irish were called Hibernians, and to this day Ireland is still known as Hibernia. Along the Ebro River lies the city of Zaragoza. When the site was taken by the Romans, they named it Caesar Augusta in honor of Emperor Augustus Caesar. It is generally believed that the name Zaragoza is derived from Caesar Augusta, but perhaps the opposite happened. Of all the Spanish towns captured, why was this place chosen to honor the emperor? Could not the Romans have recognized the similar-sounding syllables of an earlier Zaragoza with those in the name Caesar Augustus? In Hebrew, the term Gaza means strong. Zaragoza is comprised of the two words Zara and Gaza, meaning Zara's stronghold. Surely it is more than just coincidence that we find this stronghold of Zara located by the Hebrew, or Ebro, River. Chalcol was a member of the ruling tribe of Judah, descended from Zerah from the scarlet thread. When he and the Danaans set sail from Greece, their course brought them to Spain. Along their westward route, certain places stand out like Hebrew stepping stones in the sea. For example, the small island of Gozo, located north of Malta, sounds like another Gaza stronghold. And the large island of Sardinia retains elements of both Zerah and Dan in its name. Troy's dynastic line of kings starts with Dardanus. A stream of scholarship holds that Dardanus is the same person called Darda in the Bible. See 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 31. Like his brother Chalcol, Darda was a Hyksos leader from the Zerah branch of Judah. He and his Trojans were descendants of Abraham. The Dardanelles, once known as the Hellespont Strait, takes its name from Darda. The Trojans believed their ancestors originally came from Crete. The Roman poet Virgil, 70 through 19 BC, wrote the Aeneid, in which the Trojan Aeneas leads a band of escapees from the fall of Troy to Crete, the land of our fathers. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, circa AD 55 through 120, Crete also had a link to the Jews. In his Histories, Book 5, Tacitus says, "The Jews are said to have been refugees from the island of Crete, who settled in the remotest corner of Libya in the days when, according to the story, Saturn was driven from his throne by the aggression of Jupiter." This is a deduction from the name Judei, by which they became known. The word is to be regarded as a barbarous lengthening of Idei, the name of the people dwelling around the famous Mount Ida in Crete. Combining the information given by Virgil and Tacitus with our knowledge of the pre-Exodus flights, the following is deduced. During a war, an aggression, Darda was driven from his land in Egypt and fled to Crete. Perhaps his ship or fleet accompanied the band led by his brother Chalcol. These Zerahites named the famous mountain on Crete after the name of their tribe, Mount Judah, Mount Ida. Chalcol sailed on to establish Athens, and Darda sailed on to Troy. It is interesting to note that there is a second Mount Judah, or Mount Ida, located south of Troy. Apparently, Darda and his Hebrews continued the tradition starting on Crete by naming another mountain for the royal tribe. Until recently, the Trojan War was considered little more than a myth. Even the existence of Troy was chalked up as an imaginary place belonging in the realm of tales told around campfires. But from the days of Heinrich Schliemann's digs at Troy a century ago, the true facts have begun to emerge. We now know that Homer did not invent the Trojan War in his Iliad. Just as Colchis was not an accidental choice of destinations for Jason and the Argonauts, Troy was not picked on a whim by the world's greatest poet. The Greek Danaans who laid siege to the city came from the stock of Abraham, as did the Trojans. Indeed, the heroes on both sides of the conflict were related. In essence, the Iliad tells a story about an Israelite quarrel. Prince Paris, the Zerahite, had been visiting his kinfolk at Sparta. When he took their queen Helen back to his city of Troy, 1,000 ships from the tribe of Dan set sail to fight for her return. The long and bloody struggle we call the Trojan War was an all-Hebrew hostility. Troy fell after 10 years of siege, ending the war around 1184 BC. Her citizens were slaughtered, and many were enslaved by the Danaans. But out from the flames and plunder of their city, some small groups of Trojans managed to escape. In later historical writings, we learn that a Trojan prince ruled in Sicily, another band headed for Spain, and Aeneas led his followers to Crete. According to Virgil's Aeneid, Crete was only one of many stop-offs for the ships of Prince Aeneas. His final destination was Italy. Aeneas waged battles, won a bride from the Latins, and founded a new Trojan state at Lavinium. Virgil proudly proclaims that Julius Caesar sprung from this great Trojan line. The lineage of Aeneas, the Trojan prince of the Zara branch of Judah, is chronicled by Geoffrey of Monmouth. In his History of the Kings of Britain, a grand work completed during the 12th century A.D., Geoffrey recounts the details surrounding a man named Brutus. Brutus was a great-grandson of Aeneas. At the age of 15, while aiming for a stag, he killed his father in a hunting mishap. His relatives expelled him from Italy, so Brutus went to certain parts of Greece, where he discovered Trojan slaves. These kinsmen of his were born into slavery, descended from those captured during the fall of Troy. Geoffrey says that with the passing of time, Brutus grew mighty and wise. The Trojans in Greece flocked to him and begged him to lead a slave revolt. They numbered about 7,000 men. When Brutus sent a message to the king of Greece declaring their freedom, warfare commenced. The Trojan forces succeeded in destroying the Danaan army and capturing their king. Later, an agreement was worked out in which the Greeks provided 324 ships and supplies for the Trojans to leave their country. The king of Greece gave Brutus his daughter in marriage to seal the treaty. It could be said that their marriage was the final act in the Trojan War, a fitting end to the war waged for the love of Queen Helen. Brutus and his Trojan fleet sailed for a new land. Their course took them south to Africa and then westward. Along the coastline of Africa, they were pestered by pirates. We previously learned that the Greek Numidian colony in Ireland had been attacked by pirates from Africa. Indeed, this area would become the infamous Barbary Coast, whose pirates fought the U.S. Navy and Marines, the British, and the French as recently as the last century. Brutus landed his fleet in Mauritania, and according to Geoffrey, the Trojans ravaged the country from end to end. When their ships were resupplied with food, they sailed out of the Mediterranean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and landed on the Atlantic side of Spain. In Spain, on the Hebrew Peninsula, they discovered 4 generations born to exiles from Troy. Their leader was a Trojan named Corineus. An alliance formed when Brutus and Corineus realized their mutual kinship. Together, their united forces sailed around Iberia to the mouth of the Loire River. The Trojans anchored, and according to Geoffrey, they explored the land in search of food and fresh game. When the king in this region of France learned of the huge fleet, he sent messengers to determine if they had come for peace or war. Warfare commenced when the envoys met Corineus and 200 Trojans hunting without permission. Thousands died in the battles that followed. Geoffrey says the Trojans fought their way throughout the territory, and in one place along the Loire they built a fortified camp. The camp was named Turnus, for Brutus's nephew Turnus, who is buried at the site. Camp Turnus is known today as the city of Tours. Even though Brutus and his men were eventually forced back to their ships due to the constant arrival of new armies from the neighboring kingdoms, the French people have not forgotten the Trojans. On modern maps of France, one can easily spot the city of Troyes and the capital of Paris, reminding us of Troy and the Trojan prince who ran off with Queen Helen. According to Geoffrey, Brutus and Corineus sailed the fleet from the mouth of the Loire to the shores of Britain. They found the island virtually uninhabited. Brutus called it Britain from his own name, and his band of Trojans became known as Britons. They divided the island among themselves. Brave Corineus received the southern tip and called the kingdom Cornwall, which derives from his own name. Geoffrey says that Brutus explored the land, built a capital, and called it Troia Nova, meaning New Troy. Scholars can prove that the site of New Troy is now called the City of London. The royal kings and queens of Britain traced their lineage to Brutus. The kings of the Scandinavians, Merovingians, Franks, and Saxons also traced their lineage to the Trojans. The Trojan dynasty in Britain is a continuation of the Zerah branch of Judah. While the eagle and snake are symbols for the tribe of Dan, Judah's emblem has always been the lion. When Jacob blessed Judah, he compared him to 3 types of lions: a young whelp, a strong hunting lion couched for the kill, and an old majestic lion. See Genesis chapter 49, verse 9. Interestingly, according to John of Glastonbury, 14th century A.D., the Trojan arms consist of silver with 3 lions red, turning their heads to their backs, from the time of the coming of Brutus, until King Arthur adopted the symbol of the cross. Today the lion still appears in the regal heraldry of Britain, and while the British people represent the tribe of Ephraim with its multitude or commonwealth of nations, the British royals belong to the tribe of Judah. Jacob's Pillar. Prior to Jacob's sojourn in Egypt, before any of his sons were born, the Hebrew patriarch lived in Canaan. According to Genesis chapter 28, his father Isaac commanded him to not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Instead, Isaac sent his obedient son on a journey to distant relatives in search of a bride. During the trip, an event of great importance happened. Jacob and his descendants would never forget the life-changing incident. We read, "And Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night, because the sun was set. And he took of the stones of that place and put them for his pillows, and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it, and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land. For I will not leave thee, until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of." Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 15. Most people who study these verses refer to them as the vision of Jacob's ladder. His dream of angels climbing up and down was impressive. The figure of God at the top, assuring Jacob that the birthright blessings of Abraham and Isaac would belong to him, was significant. It certainly was a day to remember. It was a place to remember, and this was the beginning of a special relic known to scholars as Jacob's Pillar. We read, "And Jacob awakened out of his sleep, and he said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. And he was afraid, and said, How dreadful is this place! This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And Jacob rose up early in the morning, and took the stone that he had put for his pillows, and set it up for a pillar, and poured oil upon the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of that city was called Luz at the first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat, and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that thou shalt give me I will surely give the 10th unto thee. Genesis chapter 28, verses 16 through 22. Jacob named the place Bethel, meaning God's house. He anointed the rock he had used for his pillow by pouring oil on top of it. Then he declared that this pillar stone was also God's house, Bethel. 2 decades later, the Lord acknowledged Jacob's actions. He ordered him back to Canaan by saying, I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointedst the pillar, and where thou vowedst a vow unto me. Now arise, get thee out from this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred. Genesis chapter 31, verse 13. Bethel played a central role in Jacob's life. Significant events occurred while he was at this site. Genesis chapter 35 says that when Jacob returned to Bethel, he built an altar, and God called him Israel, meaning a prince who has power with God. To commemorate the place, he set up another stone pillar. See Genesis chapter 35, verse 14. Setting up a rock or a pile of stones was a common practice used to designate a place of importance. Some scholars believe he simply rededicated the original stone on which he had dreamed, since there was no reason to have 2 stones marking the spot. One monumental stone would help prevent the site from disappearing with time. However, if Jacob decided to take the original Bethel stone with him, keeping God's house in his tent, then it makes sense to set up the second pillar to mark the spot. Did Israel keep the stone? Did the rock, God's house, accompany the tribes of Israel on their journey into Egypt? Certain clues suggest that Jacob's pillar was indeed too valuable to have been left behind in Canaan. One clue is found on the island of Crete, where Sir Arthur Evans, the famous archaeologist, recognized several common factors among the Israelite and the Mycenaean cultures. Evans discovered that the Cretan Mycenaean religion had sacred pillars known as Beitele, a term derived from Bethel. Apparently, when the ruling Zerahites sailed to Crete during their flight from Egypt, in addition to naming Mount Ida, or Mount Judah, after their tribe, they must have set up stone pillars called Bethels. It would seem then that members of the Zerah branch of Judah were familiar with Jacob's pillar, an object they would have quickly forgotten if Jacob had left it behind in Canaan. The Beitele on Crete served as the Bethel rock, the house of God they had last seen in Egypt. The Bible has further clues that indicate Jacob's pillar was a stone carried by the Israelites. For example, during Jacob's prophetic deathbed blessings of his sons, he entrusted Joseph's family with the shepherd's stone. He did this using a parenthetical break inserted in the middle of Joseph's blessing. We read, From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Genesis chapter 49, verse 24. This statement has puzzled many scholars who believe it is part of the messianic prophecies, but they know the Messiah comes from the tribe of Judah, not the lineage of Joseph. So what is the shepherd's stone? Some surmise that the shepherd's stone is Jacob's pillar. They believe this Bethel rock, God's house, was in Jacob's tent when he prophesied on his deathbed in Egypt. It was the most significant stone in Jacob's life, and the old patriarch gave the heirloom to Joseph. Since the Israelites were shepherds and the Zerahites became known as Hyksos, or shepherd kings, it seems reasonable that Jacob's pillar was also known as the shepherd's stone. When Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt and into the wilderness, the Bible mentions a particular stone. The Hebrews used this rock as their miraculous source of water. The Lord says to Moses, Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. Exodus chapter 17, verse 6. This was not a rock out in the wilderness, but the rock. The Lord directs Moses' attention to a specific stone, and one that everyone knew, Jacob's pillar. Numbers chapter 20 gives proof that the rock accompanied the Israelites on their journey, for we learn that the stone provides water again. However, this time it is not at Mount Horeb, but at Kadesh. Also note that when the Israelites sought permission to pass through the territory of Edom, Numbers chapter 20 verse 17 says they promised to drink none of the Edomites' water. This suggests that they had their own source of water, the rock. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul implies that the rock was a special stone that traveled from campsite to campsite. He says they did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 4. Jacob's pillar symbolizes Christ the shepherd. It is the shepherd's stone entrusted to the birthright sons of Joseph, in particular the tribe of Ephraim. In later years, Jacob's pillar became the object of prime importance in the official ceremony to anoint the kings. We learned this in the episode involving Athaliah's murderous takeover of the throne, 2 Kings chapter 11. According to the Bible, Athaliah thought she had destroyed all the seed royal, and she reigned as queen. But one child escaped the slaughter and was hidden. In the 7th year, the child's protectors brought him to the temple guards. He was given the crown, anointed, and they clapped and said, "God save the king." Athaliah heard the noise in the temple. We read, "And when she looked, behold, the king stood by a pillar, as the manner was, and the princes and the trumpeters by the king, and all the people of the land rejoiced, and blew with trumpets. And Athaliah rent her clothes, and cried, Treason, treason." 2 Kings chapter 11, verse 14. Biblical translators believe a pillar is a tall column. Therefore, in describing the anointing ceremony, they say the king stood by a pillar, as was the custom. Others interpret it as by the pillar, since a specific pillar was intended. In the parallel account of Athaliah's episode, found in 2 Chronicles chapter 23, verses 12 and 13, it says the king stood at his pillar. Once again, we see a specific pillar being used, and one that belongs to the king. But some scholars render the phrase as upon or on the pillar, in reference to the rock instead of a tall column. Therefore, we can surmise that when Athaliah saw the lad standing on Jacob's pillar, she understood the significance and cried treason. Athaliah could not have recognized the child, for he was a baby when she tried to kill him 7 years earlier. The boy was unfamiliar to her. But the custom of placing the next king on the rock during the anointing ceremony made it clear to Athaliah that she was no longer in charge. Today, Jacob's pillar sits under the coronation chair at Westminster Abbey. Historical records confirm that it arrived at London in the following manner. First, shortly after the Babylonians conquered the house of Judah, the prophet Jeremiah delivered the stone to Ireland in 583 BC. In Ireland, the rock became known as Leah Fail, which denotes the stone of fate. All the Irish kings, descendants of the royal tribe of Judah, were crowned upon the stone at Tara. During its stay in Ireland, the Celts told folk tales involving the rock. For example, a work called The Colloquy of the Ancients, written sometime after A.D. 1478, says Leah Fail served as a truth and lie detector by changing colors while witnesses gave testimony upon the stone. The same work also indicates the stone of destiny could determine the fertileness of women. We read, "When a barren woman trod on it, it was a dew of dusky blood that broke out on it. When one that would bear children tried it, it was a nursing drop that it sweated." Did Jacob's pillar actually change colors and sweat drops of milk? In the past, the Irish believed Leah Fail did these things, just as intelligent Jews and Christians continue to believe Moses procured water from the rock. According to the Dinciantius, or Histories of Places, a work compiled in the 12th century A.D., Leah Fail is the stone that roared under the feet of each king that took possession of Ireland. The Colloquy of the Ancients says that when Ireland's monarch stepped on it, the stone would cry out under him, and her 3 arch waves boom. Perhaps these loud booming echoes arose from the thunderous clapping and shouting associated with the anointing ceremony, the same noise Athaliah heard when the young lad was placed on the pillar in Jerusalem. 2 Kings chapter 11 verses 12 and 13. Jacob's pillar remained in Ireland for about 1,000 years. Then, around AD 498, an Irish prince named Fergus gained a foothold in Scotland. To legitimize the prince's new kingdom with an anointing ceremony, his father, the King of Ireland, sent Leofail to Fergus. The rock never returned to Tara. In AD 843, King Kenneth MacAlpin completed the Irish conquest of Scotland. He had Leofail brought to the Scottish village of Scone, and there the rock became known as the Stone of Scone. It is interesting to note that the English chronicler William of Rishinger, circa AD 1250 to 1312, describes the Stone of Scone used in the Scottish coronations as the regal stone which Jacob placed under his head for a pillow at Bethel. In AD 1296, King Edward I of England conquered the Scots. Then, in AD 1301, he installed the Stone of Scone in his coronation chair at Westminster. The English monarchs, born in the tribe of Judah, received their kingdom while sitting in this chair containing Jacob's pillar. Geological investigations indicate the rock could not have come from any of the quarries in the vicinity of Tara or Scone. However, its sandstone texture is identical to a rock formation at Bethel in the Holy Land. Today, the official guides of Westminster Abbey proclaim the rock as Jacob's pillar. The stone is 26 3/4 inches long, 16 3/4 inches wide, with a depth of 10 3/4 inches. It has a lengthwise groove on top. 2 worn iron rings, one at each end, are attached to the rock. The rings are rust-proof, which suggests they were made from the nickel-iron alloy found in meteorites. Interestingly, the Egyptians, even earlier than 3400 BC, were working with the nickel iron from these extraterrestrial sources. A pole for porters can be slipped through the rings. The 40 years Moses and the Israelites spent wandering in the wilderness would account for the worn rings and the groove. British royalty, including the current queen, trace their lineage to both the Pharez and Zerah branches of Judah. British Celts and Anglo-Saxons belong mainly to the tribe of Ephraim, and they are the guardians of Jacob's pillar.